The North Atlantic in winter, 1000 CE. Waves the size of buildings crash against a wooden longship as temperatures plunge below freezing. Ice forms on the rigging, beards freeze solid, breath crystallizes in Arctic air. For weeks at sea, crews are exposed to conditions that would kill a modern person in hours. They have no cabin, no shelter, no walls between them and the killing cold. Most remarkably of all, they have no way to make fire. And yet they're not just surviving out there. They're winning. These are Viking longships, and for nearly 300 years they made a handful of farmers from Scandinavia the most feared force in Europe. Not because the Vikings had more men, not because they had better weapons, because they had better boats. The question is, what did they actually figure out that let a wooden ship terrorize a continent? Let's go back to the beginning because the deadliest part of the Viking ship isn't the ship you're picturing. Start around 300 BCE in the bogs of Denmark. Archaeologists pulled a boat out of a peat bog called the Hjortspring boat, and it's basically a large canoe stitched together with cord, paddled, no sail. Not scary, not fast. Just a start. Here's the thing that changes everything, though. Sometime before 800 CE, Scandinavian shipbuilders solve a problem nobody else in Europe had solved. They figure out how to build a hull using overlapping planks, called clinker construction, where each plank overlaps the one below it and gets riveted with iron nails. It sounds like a small technical detail. It is not. That overlapping design makes the hull flexible instead of rigid. Most European ships of the era were built stiff. Plank edges butted together, and stiff hulls crack apart in rough seas. A clinker hull flexes with the wave. It bends instead of breaking. Think about that. The Vikings built a ship that could twist like a living thing in a storm that would splinter anything else on the water. Then they add the piece that really seals it, a deep, strong keel running the length of the hull. The keel does two jobs. It stops the ship from tipping sideways, and it lets the ship sail into the wind instead of only running with it. Before this, most vessels were glorified rafts that went wherever the current pushed them. Now the Vikings have something closer to a sports car. Here's what makes this so important. A fast, flexible, wind-capable hull isn't just a nice upgrade. It rewires the entire map of what's possible. Suddenly, a raiding party isn't limited to the coastline near home. Suddenly, the ocean itself becomes a highway instead of a wall. 793 CE, Lindisfarne, a monastery on the northeast coast of England. The monks there have no warning system for this because nothing like it has ever come from the sea before. Longships appear on the horizon, fast, low, dragon-headed, and by the time anyone on shore reacts, warriors are already wading onto the beach. The raid is brutal and quick. Chroniclers at the time describe it as an attack from nowhere, delivered by fire-breathing dragons. That's not poetry. That's confusion. Nobody in Western Europe had seen a ship move like that before. But here's the part everyone forgets. The terrifying speed wasn't the scariest feature. The scariest feature was where the ship could go once it hit land. Viking longships had an extremely shallow draft, sometimes under a meter of water needed to float fully loaded. That meant they weren't stuck at deep water ports like every other naval power in Europe. They could sail straight up rivers. They could beach directly onto open shoreline. No dock required. A monastery 200 kilometers inland that thought it was completely safe from sea raiders? Not safe anymore. Same ship, no refit, river, or ocean. That's the trick nobody else had. And it wasn't just raiding villages. Viking fleets used this shallow draft to strike deep into places like Paris, sailing up the Seine in 845 CE with reportedly over 100 ships. Picture the panic. An entire city built around the assumption that the sea was the border, suddenly realizing the sea has no border at all anymore. Let's talk about the crew for a second, because the ship alone doesn't explain the terror. It's what the ship let the crew skip. A normal invading army in this period needs supply lines, baggage trains, marching routes, weeks of advance warning as they cross land. The longship deletes almost all of that. A raiding crew could sleep on the ship, row or sail through the night, strike at dawn, and be back on the water before local forces could even organize a response. There was no preparing for the Viking attack, because by the time you heard about it, it had usually already happened. Here's a wild detail. Excavated longships like the Gokstad ship, buried around 900 CE in Norway, show a hull built for both open ocean crossings and shallow coastal work, roughly 24 meters long, capable of carrying 32 oarsmen. Yet light enough that the crew could reportedly drag it overland between waterways when needed. A warship you can portage like a canoe. Try to picture any other 9th century military dragging their fleet across dry land to avoid a blockade. Nobody's doing that. The Vikings are doing that. But a fast, tough, shallow boat is useless if you can't figure out where you're going once the coastline disappears behind you. So here's the next problem the Vikings had to solve, and it's one people rarely talk about. How do you cross hundreds of kilometers of open, featureless ocean with no compass? The answer is unsettling in how simple it sounds. Norse sailors relied on a mix of close observation and pure nerve. They tracked the sun's position and used a device historians call a sun compass, a small notched disc that helped mark direction even under overcast skies. Sagas describe something called a sunstone, a crystal that may have let sailors locate the sun's position through cloud cover by reading polarized light. Modern researchers have tested calcite crystals for exactly this purpose, and they work. Add to that a deep knowledge of bird flight patterns, wave shapes, and the color of the water, and you get sailors who could hold a course across open sea using almost nothing but their senses. Iceland sits roughly 1,000 kilometers from Norway across open water, with nothing but ocean the entire way. No landmarks, no islands to hop between. Norse sailors made that crossing repeatedly, starting in the 9th century, well enough to found a permanent settlement. They weren't hugging a coastline like most sailors of the era. They were pointing a boat at empty horizon and trusting sun angles, bird behavior, and swell direction to get them there alive. That's not luck. That's a navigation system good enough to bet your life on. Now here's the but, because this is where it stops being a story about clever boats and becomes a story about clever people. The ship gets you to the fight. It doesn't win the fight. What made Vikings deadly wasn't just naval engineering, it was that the ship's design shaped an entire strategy around speed and surprise. Small, mobile raiding parties, hit fast, take what you can carry, vanish before organized resistance forms. It's not brute force conquest. It's a system built around one core advantage. They could always choose the fight, and everyone else could only ever react. That system scaled up beautifully too. The same hull design that let 6 guys raid a coastal farm could be built bigger into ships like the legendary great ships of later sagas, and used to move entire armies. Same core technology, adjustable from smash-and-grab robbery to full territorial invasion. And it wasn't only violence. This is the part that surprises people. The same ships that raided England also carried Norse settlers to Iceland by the late 9th century, to Greenland around 985 CE, and eventually across the Atlantic to North America. Same hull design, same shallow draft, same flexible clinker construction. One version of the ship is a weapon. The exact same version is a moving van for an entire civilization crossing open ocean nobody else dared cross. Think about that. The ship that made monks flee in terror is the same ship that let a Scandinavian family raise sheep in Newfoundland. So here's the full picture. It starts with a stitched-together bog canoe with no sail. It becomes a flexible, overlapping plank hull that bends instead of breaking. It gets a deep keel that turns it into one of the fastest vessels in the world. It gets a shallow draft that erases the line between river and sea, between coastline and deep inland safety. It gets a navigation system precise enough to cross open ocean with nothing but sun, birds, and swell. And it gets loaded with a crew that built an entire military strategy around the one advantage no one else had: the ability to strike anywhere, at any time, and simply leave before anyone could stop them. That's not one invention. That's 5 separate breakthroughs stacked on top of each other until a wooden boat rowed by farmers could make an entire continent rethink where safe even meant. And remember that opening picture, the frozen crew? No shelter, no fire, waves like buildings? That wasn't a design flaw the Vikings tolerated. That was the price of admission for owning the ocean when nobody else could. They accepted the cold nobody else would survive in exchange for a kind of freedom nobody else had. Maybe that's the real takeaway here. Every era has its version of the impossible crossing, the thing that looks like suicide until someone solves the engineering problem underneath it. The Vikings didn't set out to become legends, they set out to solve a boat problem. Turns out, solve the right boat problem, and you can rewrite the map of an entire continent.